Welcome to Lecture 8 on Sex and Gender. So we've been talking a little bit about how societies might interact and what social practices might have to do with morality. And we were thinking about also how to evaluate other societies, given that we ourselves inhabit societies that have specific practices. Well, one of the most important fundamental features of humans and also of social practices are the practices surrounding sex and gender, as is obvious for anybody who's been on Tinder or, been in a family. Very familiar social institutions and items in pop culture revolve around our sexual practices and gender. In science fiction, there's been a fair amount of treatment of this topic, especially recently, but one of the most important original texts that thinks through a lot of these questions is Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, which I've already mentioned in this course. And we're not going to read this book, but I highly recommend it for you after this course. Left Hand of Darkness imagines a society of people who are androgynous for most of their lives, except for one time in the month when they assume a gendered, they express a particular kind of gender, and then they mate during that time. This is a very different way a society could be, given the way that society reproduces. So it's clear, like in such stories like this, that the way that individuals interact with one another sexually and the way that a species would procreate is really fundamental to how a society would organize itself. So today we're going to quickly talk about sex and gender, for especially just to introduce you to the basic terms in case you've not encountered them before. And then we'll turn to a question: should humans aim to become androgynous? And today's lecture won't be that long. We'll talk, hopefully, less than usual. So, first of all, sex and gender. Well, the first thing to note is that there's been a recent practice to distinguish between sex and gender as two distinct, but in some way related, concepts. So, sex, or what is often just called biological sex, takes us as a continuum the two poles of male and female. In most species, in most, at least mammalian species, there's a male and a female. In most animals, there's a male and a female. And then in between male and female on this continuum is labeled intersex. So it is a common belief, for example, that humans are all born either male or female biologically. That is actually false. There's a fair percentage of people, on the order of magnitude of 1% or less, who are born intersex. That means people who are born with genitalia that are not clearly stereotypically male nor stereotypically female. And oftentimes there's surgery that is performed near birth or thereafter to correct, so to speak, correct in one way or the other, or to resolve the ambiguous genitalia of intersex people. But that's just to say that it's just not quite true to say that biological sex comes for free by being born. At least it doesn't come for free if you think that the only two biological sexes are male and female. Okay, so that's sex, and there's been some terminological argumentation to say that male and female are sex terms, intersex being, of course, yet another sex term. Whereas the terms for gender and gender identity are man and woman, which roughly are, in other contexts, just correspond to male and female. So gender identity is a little different in that we tend to distinguish man from genderqueer and that from women. All right, so how are we to think about these differences a little bit more? Sex refers to biological differences primarily between men and women. It includes primary and secondary sex characteristics like hair, pitch of your voice, various things that are modulated by your hormones. There's the word. Whereas gender refers to a suite of different features that are psychological, emotional, and social, and that are typically based on sex differences. So there's a lot of debate about this. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which gender is based on sex differences and exactly how that's the case. Until the 20th century, it's tempting to say until the 20th century, it was very common, at least in the West, to claim that really these psychological, emotional, and social associations we have with gender were simply determined by your sex. So if you had a certain genitalia, certain sex organs, then you were just automatically going to have a certain gender identity. That is, of course, no longer the case. So we have now additional terminology, the idea of cisgendered people and transgendered people. Cisgender people are people of a sex who have a sex that lines up in a certain way with the social associations proper to a kind of gender. So a cis woman, for example, would be somebody who is female and who identifies as a woman. A trans woman would be somebody who was born or was at some point a biological male, that's the sex, but who identifies as a woman by gender. Okay, so you always name the gender in terms of the gender expression of the person who it is. There's gender wars. I should as a caveat here, there are sort of like a lot of different actors today and public intellectuals who want to make a big fuss about sort of gender wars. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible and as what I would consider centrist and reasonable as possible about the kind of policies we should take towards transgender people. And I think one of the things that is true is that we should simply adopt the terminology of the gender presentation of those people. So trans women identify when it comes to gender as women. Okay. All right, and then there's this idea of gender presentation, and that's the outward appearance of gender. And we, people who are not, like I can only by perception know my own gender, but I can make inferences and inform beliefs about the gender of other people as well. And the gender presentation is what allows me to do that. And without gender presentation, I mean, for one, dating would be very hard. So there's the form of selection we make on the basis of gender relies on gender presentation. Okay. So, and further thing to distinguish out here is the idea of sexual orientation, which is distinct from sex and gender identity. So, sexual orientation characterizes patterns of sexual, romantic, and emotional attraction to others. I got this from a psychological manual. And we can wonder, I mean, then this is a good application, as we saw in the 1,000-word philosophy entry. We can apply our terminology and our theory about sex and gender to the question of sexual orientation. Okay, so what's the object? We can ask about the object of sexual orientation. So, I mean, it's worth wondering, because we use these terms a lot now, but even in like the middle of the 20th century, the idea of a sexual orientation was not something that people thought of. They may be thought about it, but it wasn't a term that was used commonly. Sexual orientation is a much more recent term. And you think of it, I mean, sexual orientation has the idea of you're oriented towards something. You are pointed towards something. And there's people working in philosophy of gender who talk a lot about what it would mean to be oriented towards something. But if you're oriented towards something, that makes sense to ask, well, what's the object of that orientation? What exactly is the thing towards which you're oriented when you have a sexual orientation, for example? Well, one view is that you are oriented towards a blend, the sort of mixture of a bunch of factors which include both your gender and your sex. So the idea here is that both aspects of sexuality matter when it comes to sexual orientation. So Robin Dembroff argues that some people are primarily attracted to people with certain sex characteristics. Additionally, some people are particularly attracted to transgender people regardless of their sex. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, I mean, one might, one view of general what's going on here is that we're both attracted to the physical sex, the sex organs that are one possesses, but we're also attracted to a certain way people carry themselves and behave. And the way that a person carries themselves, behaves, can be typical of a particular gender expression, and that's a thing that people are also attracted to. And this comes out when you have transgender people, because transgender people's gender expression does not line up with the social associations we have with what their sex would be. So, in the West, at least, the social associations with the gender woman are with the sex female. Okay, but with transgender women, that is flipped. So you have somebody who has a gender expression of a woman, but has a male sex. Okay, so this may be a case where we're like, well, if people are attracted to transgender women as a woman, for example, then that would suggest in that case, in at least the case of a lot of transgender women, that you're not really latching onto the sex there; you're latching onto the gender expression. But there are people who disagree with this, and there are people who think that no, sexual orientation should be primarily thought of as having sex as its object. And on this view, you're not attracted to gender at all. So this is kind of a radical view. And Kathleen Stock is a philosopher who argues that, say, a gay man might be attracted to an effeminate man, but male effeminacy is different from female effeminacy, and such a man could very well not be attracted to female effeminacy. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, the idea is like male effeminacy might be a particular way that gender is expressed, whereas female effeminacy might be a different way that gender is expressed. But what Stock is saying is that, no, what we're most attracted to here is not the effeminacy as such. So we're not attracted to the feminine aspect, the gender, the expression that the characteristics that one might have, or the sort of behaviors that one might have that we would consider feminine, effeminate. Those might be irrelevant for a gay man who might be interested more in the fact that somebody is a male as opposed to a female, more than they're interested in like whether somebody's effeminate or masculine. Okay. I should say, as another sort of caveat, that there's intense dispute about how to understand this. And in fact, in no other, if you were to go on a philosophy blog, you would see more debate, like fierce and often just absolutely brutal and not flattering, to be honest, interactions between philosophers regarding sex, gender, and sexual orientation than you will over any other topic. I can say that kind of confidently. In fact, these two people, Robin Dembroff and Kathleen Stock, are more or less enemies of one another. So, I should say that Robin Dembroff has actually been pretty influential. So, Robin Dembroff was a I should say Robin Dembroff, first of all, is a professor at Yale and professor of philosophy with a cross appointment in the law school. And Robin Dembroff was a lead author in a amicus curiae submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court for the case Bostock-Clayton County, which was a consolidated case that the Supreme Court saw that dealt with discrimination against both gay people and also transgender people. And in this case, which was handed down last month, so this is brand new news, very surprisingly, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, so the people suing Clayton County and the other organizations, for discrimination. And the arguments that Gorsuch gave in the majority opinion were actually very similar to the arguments that Robin Denbrough had in this amicus curiae. Okay, so that's interesting. So what was in this? I mean, here's a sample paragraph from the summary section of this amicus curiae. It says, it is conceptually incorrect to state that discrimination against persons who are same-sex attracted or gender nonconforming is sex neutral. If an employer decides to terminate an employee on the basis of same-sex sexual attraction or gender nonconformity, the employer must first presume the specific sex and then account for the social meanings, expectations, and stereotypes specific to the employee's particular presumed sex category. But for the concept of sex, the judgment that an employee violated one of the expectations and stereotypes specific to their sex would be impossible. Yeah, but for the concept of sex. That means without the concept of sex. Because in this argument, Robin Denbrough and others are trying to argue that discriminating people because they have a sexual orientation or because they're trans is itself discrimination because of their sex. And this is an application of what we were just talking about. The idea is that we have a lot of associations surrounding our gender concepts of women and men. But then we also have this biological fact, so what's being presumed here, a biological fact about our sex, male or female. And the idea is that in our society we have presumptions about how those are supposed to line up. We have the idea about how females are supposed to behave, and we have an idea of how males are supposed to behave. And the idea that's put forth in this amicus curiae is that it's actually discriminatory against males. It's discriminatory for males to be discriminated against because they, say, are effeminate or they dress like women. It's also discriminatory against females who want to, say, be very masculine or to wear ties or to present as men. So the idea was that, well, it seems like you would have to presume what their sex was in order for you to make any judgment about whether they're trans or not, right? So the sort of quippy way that the court put this, and the way that Denbrough puts it as well in one of their articles, Denbrough goes by they, is to say that, well, if suppose that Tom dates Rick, okay, and suppose that Ann dates another guy. So let's make it easy. Let's say Tom dates a guy, all right? And then let's also say that Ann dates another guy. Why would it be wrong for Tom to date a guy, but not for Ann to date a guy? Well, it seems like the only difference in these two cases is that we're treating a male in a way that is different from how we would treat a female, right? So it seems that you are discriminating merely because Tom is a male and Ann is a female. And you're saying, well, the associations we have with gender are that males need to act in a certain way. They need to not date men, whereas females should date men. And the court ruled that actually this is a discrimination precisely on the basis of sex, because we are forced to presume that Tom has a certain sex if we want to say that it's wrong for him to date a man. In other words, yeah, who gets to date men should not be dependent on sex. Okay. All right, so that's the general idea behind the distinction between gender and sex. All right, so we'll end today by just wondering, should humans aim to become androgynous? And this came out in the Star Trek episodes we saw. What is androgyny? Well, on the spectrums we just saw, we were talking about gender expression and sex. But androgyny is a slightly different concept, and it lies on the continuum of gender expression, right? So notice here, this isn't women and men. This is now the gender expression. These are like sort of the adjectives you might have for how one might express their gender. And androgynous sort of lies on a middle part of this continuum. And when I was like thinking about, well, what parts of modern society are already a little bit androgynous? Which ones sort of incorporate feminine and masculine elements, or else non-masculine, non-feminine elements? And I was thinking, oh, well, some K-pop maybe? So BTS, like, I don't know, if you look at the haircuts of an average K-pop star, you got some seriously, like, gender non-conforming stuff going on. So, like, I don't know, both of these haircuts could easily be on a woman according to Western societal expectations. I think he's wearing lipstick, as is he. And there's definitely there's definitely like tons of makeup, okay? So those are certainly androgynous elements because, I mean, even though there is those feminine elements, there are also some masculine elements, like they're all wearing suits and ties. So David Bowie is another great example of somebody who has a very, at least androgynous performing persona. And you see like here long hair and, again, makeup, pretty thick degree of makeup on, and obviously this sort of wacky do he's got going on. But yeah, incorporates both feminine and masculine elements. And these are distinct from from sexual orientation. Okay. What does Ferguson say about androgyny? So according to natural complement theory, which is a background to Ferguson's article, and she didn't really explain it, but I'll explain it here. According to natural complement theory, men and women have different traits, capacities, and interests due to differences in their biology, and these differences specify normal behavior for men and women. So the important point here is that men and women have different features, and those features are due merely to differences in their biology. Okay, that's one step, to say that men and women have different features, and those features are due merely to their biology. And secondly, there's the idea that these differences specify normal behavior for men and women. So it's saying, not only are the traits and capacities due merely to biology, but also those features that are due merely to biology specify the normal behavior for men and women, such that we can, with justification, say any behavior that's not that, like that, is abnormal. Okay? I mean, whenever you see normal in philosophy in general, you should always have like some sort of like error message, because you want to know who gets to say what's normal. We talked last time about the difference between somebody who's colorblind and not colorblind. Like, why is it somebody who's colorblind not normal, whereas the person who's not colorblind normal? And similarly, like, there's some people who have, can see even more colors than the average human. So what makes the average human not abnormal, and not make the person who can see more colors normal? And yeah, so there's a question about, if we allow for this, if natural complement theory is right, then what's normal is fixed by your biology and the features and the capacities, traits, and interests you have in virtue of that biology. And again, like, abnormal behavior is often thought of as pathological and something we might categorize as a mental disorder, for example, or disordered in some way. But Ferguson's going to argue, contrary to the claims of natural complement theory, that most differences in interest between men and women are due to social factors, not biological ones. So Ferguson's going to sort of get off the train at the first stop, because Ferguson's going to say that no, men and women might have different traits, capacities, and interests in our society. However, those are not due to differences in biology. They're due to primarily to enculturation and social factors, not biological factors. Okay. Furthermore, Ferguson's going to say it's not possible for men and women to be equal while playing the complementary sex roles that are widely socially endorsed. Okay, so not only is it wrong to say that men and women are different because of their biology, but there's also a normative claim. Okay, so the idea that men and women are different because of their biology is a largely empirical factor. You can like ask psychologists and sociologists why men and women differ. But there's also this normative or moral claim, which is that it's not possible for men and women to be equal from a moral perspective while playing the complementary sex roles that are widely socially endorsed. And there's a recommendation. So there's a descriptive claim, a normative claim, and then like a policy recommendation, which is that without radical change in male and female roles, the ideal love relationship, as she calls it, between people is not possible. So unless we fundamentally change the way that males and females relate to one another, the ideal love relationship between people is not possible. And Ferguson thinks that the best way to get this new relationship between males and females is to adopt a much more androgynous society than the one we already have. The problems with non-androgyny, what are they? So Ferguson's going to primarily focus on the role that, the problems that surround, that affect women in such societies. So what is women's role in production, for example? We see a lot of problems with the fact that women have specific roles in production in non-androgynous societies. Women are paid less than men for performing tasks traditionally associated with their sex, like homemaking. This should be familiar to basically anybody who's read any articles on this. Homemakers make, in the United States, very little money for the amount of work they do. They don't export any of their goods to others. They primarily keep whatever goods and services they provide to their own household. Okay, and then women's role in reproduction is also somewhat obvious in our societies. Women have a monopoly on biological reproduction. I mean, yeah, they need to be inseminated in order to biologically reproduce, but, what's 1 night to 9 months, okay? And this disadvantages them, since technology for helping them achieve parity with men is usually absent. So, I mean, there might be ways to sort of help correct for the fact that women are charged with biological reproduction. But, even these technologies are not always available. So if you get impregnated, if you're a woman and you become pregnant, you might not guarantee to have contraceptives available to, well, first of all, prevent that from happening. But also you're not guaranteed to have abortions or even health care to deal with the pregnancy once you become pregnant. On all of these, I mean, forget about the debate about abortion, for example. You could, no matter which side of that debate you take, you presumably would want some combination of maybe contraceptives and healthcare, or more healthcare, more state support for women. But all of these are very precarious in modern societies, and this has led to women being disadvantaged. Thirdly, women's role in socialization as wife and mother has been deleterious, argues Ferguson. Why? Well, women have been often portrayed as old maids or divorcees. And this is contrasted with men who are often, thought to be the cool bachelors throughout their lives. I mean, in popular culture and in movies, for example, you can see men portrayed well into their 50s and 60s as being cool bachelors, whereas women that age are often stigmatized. Old men are treated more sexually available than old women. That's certainly true in Western societies. And many women live vicariously through the activities of their children. So it's not uncommon to mark this amongst homemakers. So homemakers are, like the soccer mom, for example, is very stereotypically very involved in their children's life and 24/7 is trying to structure the lives of their children. And in fact, I mean, psychologically speaking, homemakers and people who care for whoever's caring for the children at home can sort of have this sort of postpartum depression after their children leave home. So there is definitely this effect of being somebody who only cares for their children, that it might be the case that women would ultimately vicariously live through their children. And you might be like, well, it's not like women have to do this nowadays. But women who do break this mold are often considered ballbusters or masculine women. Today, we would often say that such women are shrill. Women who are climb up the corporate ladder are often stigmatized precisely for doing that. Fourth, women's role in sexuality. So, this is a final observation that Ferguson makes. And the idea is that men often romanticize or mystify their women partners. And this obscures the individuality of women. So the idea that Ferguson has here is that men have the option to have sex a lot. Okay, promiscuity is famously a thing that has been that men are susceptible to. And how could you justify to yourself becoming less promiscuous? Well, here's one way: treat your wife and your long-term monogamous female partner in a mystical way, or in a heavily romanticize her such that you treat her as above all others, as a sort of prized possession that's better than any other woman you could have, a one-night stand with. This is a way that men could sustain long-term relationships with women. But the idea is that this obscures the individuality of women. Like, if you treat a woman as sort of your mystical possession, who's your Beatrice or something, this treats a woman not as an individual who's capable of making her own decisions, but instead as this like far off exotic source of sexual pleasure. And like, cultures often portray sex as a woman's duty and not as a source of pleasure for her. Okay, so we saw this exactly with the practice of female genital mutilation in last class, where women were expected to, even though they in their post FGM state are not able to have as much sexual pleasure as they used to have, or really very little at all, they still have a duty to have sex and to have children. And this is, of course, asymmetric with men, who pleasure in sex is sort of there's a whole structure to sex in the modern era that has made it such that men are going to derive pleasure from it. And if men do not derive pleasure from it, there's societal repercussions for women who do not put out. And a lot of these dynamics come out in a sort of exotic and bizarro story called Bloodchild that we read for today. We read Bloodchild for today by Octavia Butler. And it involves this race of the Tlick, and they're an insect-like race. And some humans arrived at their planet, they're called Terrans, and the Tlick realize that humans make good hosts for their eggs. Each family provides one person, often male like Bram Lomas, to be implanted, and these are called Tlick. In this society, reproduction is a burden for humans. The worms are very dangerous once implanted. Yet there is a paternal love from Tlick to humans. The preserve was created for the benefit of humans. So I want you to think about this story. I mean, it's very interesting because it involves a story told from a man's perspective, a young man's perspective, Gan. And it's interesting because you're hearing the thoughts of a man while that man is countenancing the possibility that he will have to become pregnant and will have to be the sort of bearer of these very dangerous worms. And will have to carry these worms to term. But it's not like, the Tlick are enslaving the humans that are there. And in fact, Octavia Butler has given interviews where she says, this is a misunderstanding of the story. The story involves not a slave. The humans are not in a slavery relationship with the Tlick. Instead, they're in an arrangement with the Tlick in which they are in a preserve that benefits them, that benefits humans. But the sort of price they pay is that they have to give one of their male offspring off to be the hosts for these worms. And again, this is another case where we're looking at an alternative, radically different perspective on how reproduction could happen. And we could ask, is this a just arrangement for reproduction? Now, what I don't want you to do is to say, here's an objection you might have, and here's a response that I would offer. You might say, well, this is an arrangement that's artificial between the Tlick and the humans. The Tlick and the humans voluntarily entered into it. And for that reason, we should, allow that it's unjust, and we should perhaps, if I were a human in that society, I would advocate for its dissolution. I would argue to get rid of it. But when we look at humans, I mean, the relationship between a human and men and women in human societies is not artificial. It's not an arrangement. Instead, it's natural. It's something that we have a biological urge to do. It's something that we see in other species of mammals. So that's a major disanalogy. And for that reason, like, maybe it's unjust. Maybe the Tlick and the humans have an unjust relationship, but then, like, that doesn't ramify back to humans. Well, I mean, one response here is that why does it matter that it's an artificial versus a natural occurrence? There's a lot of natural tendencies we have, like we saw in the last lecture, that are less than flattering. Men have a tendency to force people to have sex with them. There's a tendency in human history towards murder. Lying and cheating are things we do all the time that are not always appropriate. They seem immoral. So it seems like instead we might want to get rid of that. We might want to temper these natural practices. And also we don't want to, like, put it beyond ourselves to think that some forms of cultural engineering might be possible. It might be possible for us as humans to insist and intentionally take on the burden of changing our ways of relating to one another sexually. I mean, one easy case here is, like, it seems possible that we would sort of address people using different pronouns. Why not use they for everybody instead of he or she? That's artificial for sure. It's definitely not like the way that the natural language English sort of evolved over time very slowly. It would be, in fact, an artificial intervention that has a sort of moral aim. But why say that just because something is artificial, it's not attainable? It seems like it would be attainable, and if it would be more just to use certain pronouns, why not use them? Similarly, like, why have women carry children in the way they do? In the near future, it might be possible to have complete artificial surrogates for children. Would there be a case to be made for using those over having women carry children to the term? So these are questions to ask, like, when we're wondering, like, does the fact that something's artificial or natural play into our appraisal of whether it's a just arrangement? Because whenever we talk about sex and gender, there's always this tendency to think, well, it's always natural. But when we think a little bit further, we can wonder whether social and cultural factors play an important role, not only in our received traditional views of gender and sex, but also in engineering our way towards a different future. Now, there's other problems that Ferguson did not mention in the article that are more recent with a non-androgynous society, and other reasons we might adopt an androgynous society, and they have to do with the interests of transgender people. And trans and gender non-conforming people face ongoing discrimination. So here's just a bunch of statistics. I mean, 50% of transgender youth will have had at least one suicide attempt by their 20th birthday. Now, I mean, I know that women have it hard in society, but I'm pretty sure that this is a better predictor for suicide than just about any other demographical factor you can find. I mean, that's a very high rate of attempted suicide to have. 42.2% of transgender individuals report being prevented from using their preferred name in school. Again, find another demographic in society where that's the case at such a high incidence. 59% of transgender students have been denied access to restrooms consistently with their gender identity. That's perhaps familiar to people who follow the news. 90% of transgender students have heard negative remarks about their gender expression in school. This is so common to be worth beyond mention. 73% of transgender youth believe they're treated differently by medical personnel due to their gender identity and expression. So even medical personnel are not beyond this, people who we usually entrust to be stewards of our health. And 75% of transgender youth feel unsafe at school. And you just see all these rates of like 35% of people who are transgender have been assaulted. I mean, it's so high. 12% have seen sexual violence by grade 12. And harassment is obviously very high amongst these populations. Well, if all these are the case, I mean, this seems to be a motivation towards adopting a more androgynous society, a society in which we allow people to have alternative gender expressions. I mean, there are two things to distinguish here. One would be, should we permit more gender expressions, which there seems to be very good arguments for that. But then there's a more radical view that Ferguson is arguing for. What Ferguson is arguing is that we should, as a society as a whole, adopt a more androgynous presentation of all of our genders. We should all work on trying to make our gender expression more androgynous. We should work on making our societies less effeminate or less masculine and more androgynous. That's a more radical claim. So it's worth thinking about whether these kind of concerns are best addressed by adopting a more androgynous culture. And we see like why adopting a more androgynous culture might help in the story X, A Fabulous Child Story, because we see that X, who is, no one can tell whether X is a boy or a girl. We see that X's upbringing, is not your normal upbringing. X has to have a very highly engineered upbringing in order for X to be androgynous. But I mean, X can be androgynous. And that's sort of one of the morals of the story. It seems like it's possible for X to develop a lot of behaviors that are not associated with either gender, or to have one gender that is associated with being female, with being a girl, whereas X might develop other behaviors or capacities that are generally associated with being a boy. In the story, the parents need to be screened because most really want a baby girl or a baby boy, not an X. I mean, that's because we live in a society that's we prize non-androgynous children. We like boys and we like girls, but we don't like X's. At least this is at the time of 1972. This was probably an accurate portrayal of society. People are confused by it's an X whenever they hear it, when the parents say it, and they think something's wrong with X whenever they hear that. And in this thousands and thousands of page manual that the Joneses have when they raise X, they are told that they should not say, they should not bias their language towards saying, that X is strong and active versus sweet and dainty. They should use both. Or they should try to use less. Dainty is a pretty effeminate word, and strong it has a pretty masculine connotation in a lot of contexts. So, yeah. Finally, the girl dolls claim to be the president of General Motors, which is pretty jarring. I don't know if there's ever been a female president or a woman president of General Motors. And the princesses are rescuing princes. Actually, I've actually never heard. Good luck finding a Disney story where that's the case. There's, I guess, Mulan kind of, but still, it's not really a princess. It's like a warrior. So, at any rate, these are all different aspects of society that need to be changed if X is ever to develop in a way that's not obviously boyish or obviously girlish. And the payoff of the story is that X, at the end of the story, is a completely psychologically normal child. So says the psychologist. The psychologist, almost reluctantly at the end of the story, says, I can find nothing wrong with X. X is a perfectly normal perfectly normal child. So, well, if it were possible to develop children in the way that X is, if it's possible just to simply don't paint the baby's room pink or blue, just paint it white and give the child both dolls and a football and just see what they want to do with it. If that's possible, then why should we have these societal practices in which we expect boys to play football or expect girls to become ballerinas or princesses for Halloween? And similarly, in The Outcast, we see a radically different story in which Soren, a member of an androgynous race called the Janai, falls in love with the human Riker. The Janai viewed gender identity as a primitive characteristic. Okay, again, this would be a case in which the Janai are, as a normative desire for their culture, as a norm for their culture, they're trying to become more androgynous. They want their identity to become, gender identity of all of their people in their species to become less masculine and feminine and more androgynous. And Soren, aboard the ship with Riker, comes to identify as a woman, and she sort of comes out as a woman to Riker on the ship. But after being discovered, she undergoes psychotectic therapy, and this eliminates her gender-specific feelings. By the end of the episode, Soren feels happy and claims that the procedure cured her sickness. So there's a lot going on in this episode. On the one hand, there's a sort of feeling that, like, you kind of get the feeling in the episode that, like, it would almost be good if Soren could be a woman and live as a woman, because it seems like Soren always had thoughts that that's the case, that she wanted to be a woman, not just be androgynous. On the other hand, I mean, there's this weird element of the episode in which the race of the Janai take it to be more advanced and less oppressive in the end, that everybody be androgynous. And they have this psychotectic therapy to, in their view, this is a justice-preserving therapy. Like, they think that if we're to have a just society, we need to have an androgynous society. And if we're to have an androgynous society, then people who have the disorder of being gendered need to have this therapy made available to them, this psychotectic therapy, and this eliminates gender-specific feelings. Well, this is really hard to think through because we're humans. And it's not normal for us to always think of whether or not we should be an androgynous race and whether that's worth developing to. And we also have feelings and attitudes and in a lot of cases, justified beliefs, right? That we should be free to do as we wish. And Soren is not free to be a woman at all. Her liberty to be a woman is infringed in these cases. But think about the case. Think about whether we could modify the case in ways that would both allow Soren to have the liberty, but also to have a race like the Janai that, you know, as a norm, was trying to develop into a more androgynous society, but maybe respected liberty. What would we think about those societies? Or alternatively, like, should we in fact be more like the Janai and have something like psychotactic therapy be available? There's a lot to think about here, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this when we talk on Wednesday. So, just a few quick notes. I mean, there is the oddity that Soren would default to a bisexual gender identification. Like, it's just funny in all Star Trek episodes that all of the races that they encounter, like, some of them do have weird gender dynamics, but almost without fail, all these alien races have men and women. You might wonder if that's there's a universal biological fact that this is something that happens, that you have men and women. Moreover, so you might think that, like, our gender associations are due to either to our human practices and culture or to our biology, or some combination of both. Soren identifies as a woman over time, which suggests that the Janai have norms against gender identification. And it's worth noting that the Janai had, presumably in the past, had the biological capacity or even the tendency to identify with a gender. But through a long process of enculturation, the Janai have come to no longer identify with any particular gender. Okay, so I'll leave you with these questions. What reasons are there for humans to adopt a normatively androgynous culture? Are there biological impediments to making society androgynous? And should we try to overcome these impediments, even if they are hard? And similarly, are the Janai's practices morally regressive or regressive? What should we think about them? And similarly, like, you can think about all this in light of X's experience in X, the Fabulous Child story. Should we have a society that is more like X's, that involves raising children more in the way that X was raised? Okay, so we thought about society, how we treat other societies, and also how sex and gender interface with our understanding of the way we relate to others. And the next week, we're going to think more about two of the most lofty questions that arise in science fiction and philosophy. One, how we should treat others from the broadest perspective possible when we think about God and overlords, and what we owe to others, and what we owe to our so-called inferiors. And then we'll secondly talk about the niche, very obscure philosophical topic, the meaning of life. So I'll see you then.